You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, we're talking with Professor Jeremy Hodgen. Jeremy is Professor of Mathematics Education based in the Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment at the IOE. Jeremy's work on maths has had an impact at just about every level of education. He's written national guidance for the Education Endowment Foundation on improving mathematics in Key Stages 2 and 3, based on systematic reviews of international evidence that he has carried out. And his work has framed the current debate around maths in post-16 education in England as well. Jeremy is part of a team of IOE researchers that have been investigating various aspects of policy and practice relating to attainment grouping. And today we're going to talk with Jeremy about this interesting and at times controversial topic and how it affects student outcomes in maths. Hello, Jeremy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob.
Jeremy, let's talk first of all about you and your research journey. You started out as a teacher of maths in schools. Tell us about your experiences in the classroom and how that informed your transition into academia and to UCL.
Well, I trained as a primary teacher at the Institute of Education many years ago. I've also actually taught secondary schools. I loved teaching maths, but one day I spotted an advert for a PhD at King's College London with Philip Adey on cognitive acceleration. I didn't actually get that PhD, but through the interview process, I met David Johnson and I started a PhD looking at professional development in mathematics education. And at that stage, King's was a really exciting place to be. There were a lot of exciting academics at King's: Stephen Ball, Brian Street, Margaret Brown, Mike Askew, Joe Bowler, Dylan Willem. And it really opened my eyes to what educational research can do, both in terms of thinking about how children learn, but also in terms of how we can help teachers teach better. And the group at King's were really focused on that problem. How do you enable teachers to teach better? So since King's, I've worked at Nottingham University. I went there to work with Malcolm Swan, one of the great curriculum developers in mathematics, who's unfortunately died recently, and Andy Noyes, who's really interested in mathematics participation. But obviously, when the opportunity came up to work at the Institute of Education, the best place in the world to work, I was very attracted to work in this organization with the great people that work here.
So as we dive into this topic of grouping, I think it'd be useful for our listeners if we defined our terms and clarify some fundamentals. So we'll use the term attainment grouping as you do in your research, but that is a term that often gets talked about interchangeably with ability grouping. Now, there is an important distinction between the two. Could you explain what we mean by attainment grouping and how and why this is different to grouping by ability?
Yes. Well, attainment grouping is grouping based on children's actual attainment, not any predictions of what they can do in the future. It's actually very difficult to predict what children can do in the future from their attainment now or at any one point in time. We tend to mix up the notion of ability with children's actual attainment. We're quite unusual in England in the way that we think that children have a natural ability in all sorts of subjects, but particularly so in mathematics. When you look at other countries around the world, particularly countries that do really well in mathematics, they tend to emphasize effort more and the fact that you can actually do better at maths and place less emphasis on ability. So ability is a rather nebulous term that often involves labeling children rather than looking at what they can actually do. So we refer to attainment grouping to recognize that actually what's important is what children can do now to figure out what they need to learn next.
Can you tell us what grouping looks like in primary and secondary schools? So do they approach this differently?
Yes and no. I said we're unusual in this country. We have possibly the most prevalence of setting. Our colleague John Jerram looked at the PISA and TIMSS data and found that 100% of schools in the PISA and TIMSS studies set children at year 9 or at age 15. So by set, I mean that children, young people, are placed into a top set of high attaining pupils, often referred, as you said, Rob, often referred to as a high ability set, and a middle ability or a middle attainment set, and a bottom set. In primary schools, it's a little different, but the prevalence of grouping and setting is very high, particularly in year 5 and year 6. And again, in primary schools, there is a great deal of grouping by ability, or it's actually, of course, grouping by attainment within classes. So children in primary and secondary are placed in groups where they're working with children of very, very similar attainment.
Do schools use different grouping approaches according to subject? So is setting, for example, more likely in certain curriculum areas?
Settings more likely in maths. So we ourselves carried out a survey last year. And for example, we found in year 10, almost 90% of students were set in maths, whereas in English, it's only about 50%. And in other subjects, it's much less. So there's quite a difference between subjects.
So at school level, who's responsible for making these decisions? Is it something that a head teacher will decide? We're going to do setting, we're going to set like this, or is it left up to subject heads or groups of teachers to decide how students are organised?
Well, it depends on the school. We have in England, many people believe that mathematics is a subject where you have to set. This isn't the case in other countries, as I've said. And in some other countries, it is actually illegal to set for any length of time, for example, in Norway. But in this country, when you asked about decisions about setting, it depends on a whole range of factors. It depends on the school size. It may be left to the head of maths. It may be a decision by the head teacher. It may be a decision by groups of teachers working together. In primary, it tends to be led by a focus on the national tests at year 6 and a belief that setting will improve the results of all students. We actually know from the research evidence, such as it is, that it doesn't actually appear to improve the results very much. There's a slight tendency for the higher attainers to do better and the lower attainers to do worse, but the effects are very small.
So I mentioned in the introduction that grouping is a bit controversial, and you've indicated a bit there why, because there are findings in the research evidence that suggest that it might be better for some children than others. So could you expand a little bit on that? You've mentioned that it sort of works a bit differently for the higher attainers and the lower attainers, but are there other impacts and effects as well, so on perhaps the social side of things or pupils' concept of their self as a learner or other things?
Well, we've looked at self-confidence. So in our study, the best practice in grouping students study, we examined what happened with students' self-confidence over time, over the first 2 years of secondary school. And we looked at general self-confidence and subject self-confidence in mathematics and in English. And we found that general self-confidence for children placed in mathematics sets improved for children placed in top sets relative to the middle set, and got worse for children placed in bottom sets relative to the middle set. So over time, the gap in self-confidence grew between the top set and the bottom set. And obviously, self-confidence really matters to kids. It really matters in terms of their attitudes to learning and also in terms of their aspirations for the future. So that's an important finding. And that finding was after controlling for all sorts of factors, including prior attainment. So the self-confidence gap got wider. We also found that the attainment gap across both subjects got wider over time.
But both of those they sound quite serious, and some listeners might wonder whether that's quite a high price to pay for a grouping strategy.
Well, it is, isn't it? I think it's partly to do with our belief in this country about the notion of ability. It's common sense, isn't it, that if you place children in attainment groups, that means that the teaching might be more appropriate to them. It turns out that that's not the case. There was a report about 5 years ago for the Department for Education which looked at how schools were tackling disadvantage and enabling students from disadvantaged backgrounds to do better in education. And they found that a third of the schools were relying on some kind of setting with other strategies. So they were relying on some kind of attainment grouping. Yet we actually know that this doesn't actually make things better. That's such as the research evidence as it is. I mean, the research evidence is very US focused, where the situation is really quite different to the situation in England. Some of that research is rather elderly. So our new project is actually doing something more appropriate to the English setting, where we're comparing a group of schools that have a history of mixed attainment teaching with a group of schools with a history of setting that are matched to those mixed attainment schools. And we're comparing the attainment and self-confidence over time for the kids that are placed in those groups in mathematics. And we're looking at that over year 7 and year 8. So hopefully in a couple of years' time, we'll have some better evidence about the situation in England based on schools that are, I guess, doing setting or are doing mixed attainment as well as is possible. I suppose it's kind of interesting to think about why attainment grouping might not work. Dylan Willem talks about teaching to the middle, and it might be that when children are placed in attainment groups, teachers think that they've got the attainment right and they can just teach the middle. Whereas we know from all sorts of research, including our colleague Sue Hallam's research, that actually we're not terribly good at placing children accurately in set groups. Indeed, in our own research, we found that set placement was quite inequitable. So we looked at the schools in our control group in our last project. So these were the schools that were continuing to practice as they'd already practiced. They weren't involved in any sort of intervention or work with us. And we looked at which students were placed in the top set, the middle set, and the bottom set. And we looked at disadvantage or socioeconomic status in technical terms. We also looked at boys, girls, the gender issue, and we looked at ethnicity. And we found that there wasn't a real difference for disadvantage, which surprised us. But we found that there was a real difference for ethnicity and for gender. And for example, Black students were 2.5 times more likely than white students to be misallocated down a set. And that is a real concern. It's not that schools are doing this deliberately. I mean, with the Black Lives Matter, there's been a real focus in the news about unconscious bias. And it's likely that that's what's going on here. There's some unconscious bias, even in schools that took part in our study that were really interested in doing something about equity and were really interested in doing attainment grouping well. So even those schools find it difficult to avoid being inequitable in the way that they place students in sets.
Hearing what you're saying about this, how much of what we see in this issue is what we might term a self-fulfilling prophecy? If low retaining and sometimes disadvantaged students track these labels of low ability and then we gather them up into teacher units that we label bottom sets, does that do anything to lower the self-image of those young people as seeing themselves as somehow less capable? And does it do anything to the expectations of the teachers who lead those classes?
Well, the short answer is yes to that. We carried out a review of the research in this area, and we found that both of those things are true. The self image and associated with that, the self confidence of children placed in lower set tends to reduce over time, and that can't be good for those kids. And I mean, what happens when you place children in sets is that the lower sets tend to get a kind of reduced and restricted curriculum. And that in turn has an effect on both them and an effect on teachers. Teachers who are usually very interested in improving the kids and giving the kids a good education. In my work on mathematics, in my recent study for the Nuffield Foundation, where we looked at low attainment in mathematics at year 9, we found that in the low sets, the students really liked their teachers and they really valued the teaching that they were getting. And the teachers were really interested in really doing something to improve the mathematics of those students. But they also kind of wanted to protect them from failure. And I mean, failures are really, I mean, you don't want kids to feel that they've completely failed, but actually mistakes are important for mathematics. We don't learn mathematics by getting everything right. We learn mathematics from making mistakes, and mistakes are a really valuable learning point for mathematics. It's only by making mistakes that we can see the things that we're doing that are correct are actually correct. And protecting the children from those mistakes and errors really doesn't help their learning. So for lots of good intentions, those teachers' kind of expectations of the students were lower, even though they were trying to do the best by those students.
I want to ask you about some of the practical ideas and how schools might moderate some of the worst effects of setting. You mentioned already that you're working with schools who have a history of doing mixed attainment teaching and to try to highlight the things that they might be doing that work. So if we have heads of maths, teachers, school leaders who are listening might be alarmed at some of the effects of setting that you've been describing. What's the advice for them? Your team has produced a list of do's and don'ts, haven't you?
From our research, we've looked at do's and don'ts for setting and do's and don'ts for mixed attainment grouping. I think before I delve down into some of the recommendations there, I'd urge a head of maths to be cautious about going wholesale into changing their grouping practices overnight. My colleague Becky Taylor has looked at why schools find it difficult to do mixed attainment teaching, and she identified a fear on behalf of teachers and actually of other people within the system, particularly parents, of some kinds of mixed attainment groupings. What really makes a difference in the schools that we've seen do mixed attainment well, and actually those schools that have done setting well, actually, is that they've focused on the mathematics teaching. And when schools have changed to mixed attainment teaching, they've usually done it gradually. One of our schools just changed to mixed attainment teaching in year 8 and year 7. In one of their kind of bands, they organized the schools into bands, not attainment or ability bands, just bands for the timetabling. And they went through it gradually, and they focused on good mathematics teaching. One of the benefits of mixed attainment grouping in terms of teacher development and teachers working on their pedagogy and their teaching is that in mixed attainment, teachers are all teaching the same thing. So whereas in an attainment group, they're likely to be teaching something rather different. They may be teaching the same topic, but they'll be using different tasks and maybe different textbooks. Whereas in mixed attainment grouping, they'll be teaching the same thing, so they have something to talk about, something to plan together, and something to reflect on and improve for the next year. So my advice to a head of maths would be, within any form of grouping, to focus on making mathematics teaching better. And in terms of our do's and don'ts, well, we looked at the research evidence, and one of our do's, for example, is do make subject setting as subject specific as possible. Try to avoid streaming. Don't put students in English sets on the basis of their maths results. Don't put students in science sets on the basis of their English results. And don't assign a subject expert teacher only to the top sets. In our last best practice in grouping study, we found that there was a slight tendency for schools to allocate better qualified maths teachers to the top sets. The bottom sets often need the better teachers. In terms of mixed attainment grouping, one of our do's was, often in mixed attainment teaching, there's in-class groupings. Do change those regularly. And don't just teach to the middle. Think about all the kids in your class and differentiate by outcome rather than by task. The reason for differentiating by outcome is that if kids are all doing the same task, they've got something to share and talk about both at the beginning and the end of the lesson. So kids can learn from each other as well as learning from the teacher.
What you were describing just a moment ago about teachers in doing mixed attainment teaching, that sounds to me like it could be a more collegiate experience if they're all more likely to be working together on the same thing. So what do teachers say about that experience? Is that something that they talk about positively?
Yes. I remember visiting a school in Birmingham which had been doing mixed attainment for a long time, from year 7 to year 11. And I asked one of the teachers what it was like. And he said, "Oh, it's really difficult, but I love teaching here." And I think that I found that a very powerful experience, because what he and the other teachers in that school valued was a realization that teaching is difficult and it's enjoyable because it's difficult. And noticing the difficulties within teaching enables you to make your teaching better. So you're absolutely right that it's one way of making teaching more collegiate. I wouldn't like to give the impression that all schools that are doing setting are wrong. I mean, you can do a lot of this within setting schools, and particularly in maths, given the number of and the proportion of schools that are doing setting. It wouldn't be right of me to say that those teachers are wrong. I think you can create some of those collegiate experiences in other schools. It's just that mixed attainment teaching is one way of facilitating that.
We'll just talk briefly about the COVID-19 pandemic, because that's really been given schools quite a shock in terms of, well, just about everything, but in the way that they organise things for teaching and learning. There are things that are coming on the agenda that they're having to think about and organise for that they don't tend to do very often. Things like class sizes and how many children you have in one room and so on. And schools are being encouraged to maintain bubbles to reduce infection and so on. And I'm just wondering whether this might be an opportunity here for some schools to think about the less effective and the more questionable grouping practices and bring some of that into the rethink. And what I'm kind of picking up from you is that there's a sort of proceed with caution around this, because it doesn't sound like it's advisable, if you are a school rethinking this, to sort of to change it overnight, because there might be resistance to that.
Yes, we've just carried out some research into schools, what schools are doing now in terms of their grouping practices in the context of distance education, and looking at the differences between low and high attainers. So we've surveyed the schools in our current study, and we've interviewed a number of heads of maths about this. It seems at the moment that schools are trying to keep their existing grouping practices. And they're doing that because they want to keep the relationship between the students and their teacher. In this case, it's mathematics teaching. So they're really keen to keep that relationship going. Of course, many of those schools are pointing to issues of disadvantage, and how many students just aren't able to access the curriculum, either because they haven't got a laptop or a good internet connection, or simply because they just don't have space to work at home, or that there are other things that are distracting them when they're outside school. The schools are saying to us that they're really thinking about what they'll do next year. I agree there are some opportunities here. If schools are having to teach kids in relatively small bubbles, one way of maintaining the social distance issues is to have less moving around the school, and to keep students in classes, rather like primary schools, so that they could stay in their classes, and you could teach different subjects to a mixed attainment class. I mean, certainly Becky Allen thinks that mixed attainment would make the teacher supply crisis a little easier, because it enables more flexibility around the timetable. So that's beyond the COVID problem. I mean, it will be a huge problem in our schools, and it will be a huge problem to balance the issues of catch up, because children do have to catch up with something, whatever catch up means. They've got to have some equal playing field. So we're going to have to provide something for the kids who've had very little, and to balance that with some kind of enjoyment of learning, and the opportunity that kids have to see what learning can do. I worry that we might end up with a lot of rather dull classes, particularly in mathematics, just focusing on issues of calculation, which would be counter-effective, because it would put kids off mathematics.
I just wonder whether perhaps there's a risk of almost going back the other way. That schools, because they perhaps have a faith in setting and grouping being somehow good for as part of this catch up, whether what they'll actually do is they'll move even further in that direction, and they'll perhaps have even smaller groups of kids who are grouped on the basis of ability or attainment, and maybe that might sort of entrench the situation. Do you think there's a possible risk of that?
Oh, yes, I think there's a possible risk of streaming, and streaming is a really bad option. We know that students have spiky profiles. They're better at English than they are in maths, or better at science, they're better at geometry than they are at number. And it's really important that we do not stream children in science or mathematics on the basis of their English results. But it's a really difficult task for schools. One of our teachers in our interviews, Rob, I wanted to give him a medal, because he was just doing everything for his kids. And he was in a mixed attainment school, and he talked about mixed attainment as in terms of his moral duty to offer all kids the opportunity to see all of mathematics as far as was possible. And he was saying, the students who are not able to access the curriculum now are the low attainers. And he said, I might have to set them. Although I know it's morally wrong, these were his words, because I have to enable them to catch up with where they should have been. And that's a real moral dilemma for teachers in our schools. And teachers in our schools will be facing that in all of our schools at the moment. It's a very hard task.
It's certainly a tricky one and with a moral dimension, but it is nice to hear that there are medal-winning teachers out there who have it on their minds. Jeremy, thank you for joining us on the podcast. It's been really interesting talking with you and hearing about this work. And it's massively important work too, in my view. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Rob.
You can follow Jeremy on Twitter at Jeremy Hodgen, and you can learn much more about his research and those practical strategies that he mentioned via links in the episode notes. There are lots more episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as other IOE lectures, debates and podcasts available. All you need to do is search IOE podcast from your preferred podcast provider. Sadly, we haven't been able yet to persuade Stormzy, Beyonce or Kate Bush to appear on the podcast, but we do have the next best thing. They all feature on our Spotify playlist of songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. All of that is accessible via our UCL webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.